And one of the things I'd like to talk about, I'm going to leap because we've got to have time for questions, is into if this is so important that it takes our personal act into the way we understand our civil society working, that brings us to why perhaps Erdogan finds Gulen such a threat.
Yeah.
Gulen is talking about the way we order our civic lives.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about politics with a small p, that is,
right.
our civic responsibility.
Right, right.
And this is what antagonises those who see politics with a capital P?
Yeah.
As a party?
Yes, and of course in Mr. Erdogan's case, part of the way in which he has succeeded in Turkey is to offer an image of himself to pious Turkish Muslims of being a pious Muslim, which if one follows his career and watches his actions, one understands he is not. But it's the image that he wants to convey. And here's this guy, Gulen, who is actually genuinely pious, and who doesn't have political ambitions the way Erdogan was to have power. Gulen's understanding of Islam is a civic understanding. How does Islam fit in to the rest of the world? The form of Islam that appeals to Erdogan is how can Islam dominate the world? Those are two very different perspectives. And Gulen has nonetheless been very successful in spite of his disinterest in political power, and that has to be enormously psychologically threatening to someone like Mr. Erdogan. When I think of their relationship, I think of the fairy tale with which you may be familiar of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, where the wicked stepmother has a mirror that is on the wall, and every morning she consults the mirror and asks it, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror says, "Well, you, my queen, are the fairest." Until one morning the mirror says, "Snow White is." And it drives the wicked stepmother crazy. She cannot rest until she kills or tries to kill Snow White, because she cannot bear the thought that there is actually someone fairer than she. And I have this image of Erdogan looking in the mirror every morning, and in his gut he knows he's not what he pretends to be. And worse than that, he knows that there's someone who is what he pretends to be without trying to pretend to be anything else. I asked Gulen himself at one point, "Why does Erdogan have it in for you so seriously?" And he said, "Well, back when we still had a relationship, he was setting off for a meeting which through my network of connections I understood was going to be very dangerous for him politically. So I called him up and I said, "Recep, you really shouldn't go to this meeting." And Gulen said, "He's afraid that at some point I'm going to give the details of that and it will be embarrassing to him. I would never do that." He wasn't telling me the details. He said, "I would never do that, but he fears that I will. And the only way he will rest is if I'm no longer around, because then he doesn't have to fear that any longer." Because of course, Erdogan is someone who would in an instant do whatever he needed to do for himself, even if it hurt you. So it's that kind of a specific, and then the broader kind of psychological picture, I think, that helps account for his hostility. And it's convenient that Hizmet can be his go-to boogeyman. As I said, even the recent earthquake was blamed somehow on Hizmet by Mr. Erdogan, who himself, if you followed it at all, you know that he failed miserably to act as he might have, could have, should have in bringing aid to the victims of the earthquake. And more than that, of course, part of the reason the consequences of that earthquake were as bad as they were because he had failed as the leader of the government to abide by the kinds of building standards that he should have, so the buildings that were built were not built as they should have been. So from beginning to end, there's a lot there that he can be held responsible for, but he's not the kind of person who would ever say, "Oh, it's my fault." It's Hizmet's fault. That's a much easier kind of way to approach it from his point of view.
Yes, and perhaps it also explains why Hizmet for Erdogan is something he needs to fear desperately and deeply, because it
Absolutely.
represents everything in terms of civic behaviour that he does not represent.
Yeah, yes.
So he has good reason to be.
Yeah, and you know, there's an irony in coming back to where I began this evening with the fake coup, the irony of his attempts to destroy Hizmet. And mind you, where he has succeeded, it has been enormously destructive to Turkey because he's closed hundreds of schools, precisely in places where schools are desperately needed, but also other countries that he could either bully or bribe, B&B, bully or bribe. Schools were closed down that had been established by Hizmet simply because they were in places where they're desperately needed. So he's harmed many, 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 many people, including many, many, many Turks. What he hasn't succeeded in harming, in the real sense, is Hizmet. I mean, there are many people of Hizmet who have been tortured, who have been imprisoned, and so on and so forth. But in a larger sense, in the United States, Hizmet was virtually unknown until Erdogan, post-July 2016, started to make a big deal about it. And then at least people are asking, what is this? Who is this guy Gulen? What is this Hizmet stuff about? So actually, Hizmet has been more successful, and I think it will continue to be more successful, albeit away from Turkey, as the days roll on, as the years roll on, in spite of, and in some respects, ironically enough, because of Erdogan's attempts to destroy it.